A cracked leather-filled journal rides on Desmond Calloway's dashboard, its pages soft with a decade of notes and grape row numbers nobody else bothers to walk. On Saturday morning, he coats his vines white with kaolin clay, calm and exact, while his daughter watches from the truck seat. And Holt Ferguson pulls up laughing, waving growers over to gawk at the vineyard guy painting his rows like a fence. No child should have to watch that. Nobody asks why he checks every cluster's temperature before he sprays, or why he writes each number down. Weeks later, in a heat wave breaking county records, a young farmhand reaches into the truck to pack the journal away for him. She stops cold at an old university envelope tucked inside the cover. Chapter 1. Public Humiliation. The sprayer tank thumped against Desmond Calloway's back with every step, and the kaolin clay inside it had already dried a pale ring around the nozzle. He stopped at the first post of the Cabernet Franc block closest to the county road and lifted the infrared thermometer to a cluster hanging low in the leaves. 89 degrees on the fruit itself, and it wasn't even 9 in the morning. He said the number under his breath, clicked the trigger again to be sure, then wrote it in the notebook wedged against his hip. Row 14. Vine 6. Before treatment. Nadia sat sideways in the truck with the door open, sneakers swinging above the gravel, watching him work the way she'd watched him do most things since she was old enough to sit still. A truck slowed on the county road, then it turned in. Holt Ferguson parked at an angle that blocked half the lane and climbed out, laughing before he'd even shut the door. "Well, look at this," he called, loud enough to reach the 2 men riding with him. "Man's dressed his vines up for church." Desmond kept the thermometer up and didn't answer. "Y'all gotta see this," Holt said, waving the men toward the fence. One of them, an older grower named Bill Tackett, got out slower than the rest and stayed back. "Painting his rows white like a picket fence. Desmond, son, that's a real interesting way to lose a season." "It's kaolin clay," Desmond said, not looking up from the notebook. "Reflects the heat off the fruit." "Uh-huh." Holt grinned at the others like he'd won something. "And the rest of us just been doing it wrong for 40 years. Nadia had gone still in the truck seat, her sneakers no longer swinging. Desmond capped the thermometer, hung it from his belt, and moved to the next vine. He measured, he wrote the number down. He did not look toward the fence again, and the not looking cost him something. A tightness behind his jaw, a breath let out slow through his nose while his hand stayed steady on the wand. Bill Tackett didn't laugh. He stood with his arms crossed, watching Desmond's hands more than his face, and said nothing at all. "They let anybody buy dirt around here now," one of the other men said, and that one got the bigger laugh. Holt let the laughter run its course before he raised a hand for quiet, still grinning. "I'm not trying to run you off, Desmond. I'm saying a man ought to ask somebody who's done this a while before he goes and paints 2,000 vines white." He looked past Desmond toward the truck, toward Nadia, and something in his face softened just enough to be worse. "Your girl watching you do this?" Desmond's hand stopped on the wand for exactly 1 second. "She's watching me finish my rows before it gets hot," he said. Holt held both hands up, still amused, already backing toward his truck. "Fair enough." He climbed in, leaned out the window once more. "I'll tell you what, I'm going to enjoy watching how far this goes." The truck rolled back onto the county road. Bill Tackett lingered a moment longer than the others, glanced once at the white rows stretching down the hill, and then followed without a word. Desmond stood at the fence a moment, tank straps cutting into his shoulders, looking at the reading still glowing on the thermometer's small screen. Then he walked back to Nadia, reached into the truck for the water jug, and drank without saying anything about what had just happened. She watched him a moment before she spoke.
"You gonna tell him he's wrong?"
"Not today," Desmond said and picked the sprayer back up. He returned to the vines. Behind him, the notebook sat open on the truck seat, its cover soft at the corners, a torn white edge of something tucked just inside the front flap, where the binding had started to loosen. Chapter 2. Escalation. Gary Wexler's county truck came up the drive a few days later, sun flashing off the extension office decal on the door. He parked square, not at an angle like Holt had, and walked the first 2 rows with a clipboard instead of a smile. "Mr. Calloway." He said it like he was confirming a name on a form. "Got a call from a couple of your neighbors. Concerns about an unauthorized foliar treatment on registered co-op acreage."
"It's kaolin," Desmond said. "Surround-type clay particle film. Reflects solar load off the fruit and canopy."
Gary tapped his pen against the board, without writing anything yet. Co-op Standard 4.2 requires disclosure of any treatment outside the approved input list before harvest certification. He glanced up. "You didn't file anything?"
"I didn't know I needed to file paperwork to protect my own fruit."
"That's not really the question, is it?" Gary made a note. "The question is whether this compromises varietal presentation. Buyers pay a premium for consistent skin color on the Cab Franc. A white residue in the cluster zone raises concerns about sunburn masking, hiding damage instead of preventing it." Desmond stopped walking. "It's not masking. Sun-scald and sunburn aren't the same failure. Scalds are localized cell collapse from a rapid light-to-shade reversal. You get that from overthinning the canopy right before a heat spike. Sunburn's cumulative UV load on exposed fruit over time. The clay drops the surface temperature on the berry itself. It's not hiding a defect, it's preventing one." For a moment, Gary didn't say anything. He looked at the pale rose running down toward the creek, then back at Desmond, and something in his face recalculated before it settled back into procedure. "That's a fairly specific distinction for a hobby operation." "It's the distinction that matters," Desmond said, and went back to checking the drip line at his feet. Gary wrote for a while without speaking. Off near the equipment shed, Sasha Nunez had stopped restacking, picking lugs to listen, one hand resting on the stack, not moving. "I'm not here to shut you down," Gary said finally. "I'm telling you the Co-op's Cosmetic Standards Committee meets in 6 weeks to review the full lots. If this treatment leaves visible residue at harvest, or if quality scores come back soft because buyers think you're covering something up, your certification's the thing at risk. Not mine to decide, just mine to warn you." He tore a carbon sheet free and held it out. "Sign here saying you received the notice." Desmond signed without reading it twice, the way a man signs something he already knows the shape of. Gary folded his copy into the clipboard, nodded once, and walked back to his truck. He didn't look back at the rose again. Sasha waited until the county truck was most of the way down the drive before she came over, still holding a lug crate against her hip. "Where'd you learn that?" "The scald thing, the cell, whatever you called it." Desmond crouched to check a drip emitter, turning it slowly between 2 fingers. "Read about it somewhere." "That wasn't reading about it talk." She wasn't smiling when she said it, just watching him the way you watch someone who's given you half an answer on purpose. That was somebody's whole job talk. He didn't answer that either. He straightened up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked toward the shed where the afternoon sun was already starting to lean hard on the west rows.
We've got 4 more blocks before dark," he said, and picked the coil of drip tubing back up.
Sasha held his eyes a second longer than she needed to, then let it go and followed him down the row. Chapter 3. Suspicion. By the time they got the last bin loaded, the light had gone that particular orange it only got in July, low and heavy over the ridge. Sasha carried the spray gear to the truck bed while Desmond coiled hose, and when he went back for the water jugs, she reached into the cab to move his field journal off the passenger seat so she'd have room to sit.
It fell open against her palm.
Pages of numbers, berry temperatures logged by row and vine number, dates running back years, small diagrams of canopy angles with arrows and crossouts. Tucked into the inside cover, half slipping free, was an envelope gone soft and grey at the folds. The return address, still legible under a coffee ring, Department of Plant Pathology. She was still holding it when Desmond came around the truck bed.
"Sorry," she said, not moving fast, not trying to hide that she'd seen it. "I was just moving it."
He held his hand out, and she gave it back without being asked twice. His phone rang before either of them said anything else. He glanced at the screen, stepped half a turn away, and answered it low. "Hey, yeah, I've got about 6 days before the heat gets here. I saw the forecast." A pause. "No, the coverage held on the west blocks. I'm more worried about the young Petit Verdot. Thinner bark, less canopy to work with." Another pause, longer. "I will. Thank you, Dr. Whitcomb." He ended the call and stood there a second with the phone still in his hand, like he was deciding something. Sasha was studying the ground near her boots, giving him room, but she wasn't good at pretending she hadn't heard. "Piedmont, Virginia offers a plant pathology cert through the community college," she said. "I'm doing night classes there for environmental science. I know what that department stamp means." Desmond closed the journal and set it on the dash, cover down. "Then you know it doesn't mean much by itself."
"It means something." She wasn't pushing, just saying it plain. "You correct county inspectors on cell physiology. You've got a professor calling you about bark thickness on a Tuesday."
He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice wasn't hard, just closed. "I appreciate you not making a thing out of it in front of Wexler. I wasn't going to." She picked up her bag from the truck bed, slinging it over one shoulder, and for a second she looked like she might say something else, ask the real question, sitting behind the one she'd already asked. She didn't. She'd spent enough Tuesday nights in a classroom full of people who assumed she was there to fill a seat to know what it cost somebody to be underestimated on purpose. "I'll see you Thursday."
"Thursday," Desmond said.
She was almost to her car when the truck radio, still running off the battery, caught the tail end of the 5 o'clock forecast. He reached in and turned it up. Expanding heat dome will push daytime highs into the low hundreds by midweek, with little overnight relief. The National Weather Service has issued an extreme heat warning for the region, the first of its kind on record for this time of year. Desmond stood with his hand still on the dial, looking down the rows toward the Petit Verdot block, where the vines were young and the bark was thin, and none of it had been touched with clay yet. Chapter 4. Maximum Escalation. The thermometer nailed to the equipment she'd read 108 by 11 in the morning, and the air over the gravel drive had started to shimmer the way it did over a road in August, except this was only July, and it wasn't supposed to do that yet. Desmond had Nadia and Sasha, both out early, working fast through the Petit Verdot block before the sun climbed higher, the young vines, thin bark, no clay on them yet because he'd run out 2 days before, and the supplier in Charlottesville was back-ordered clear into next week. He was mixing a stretched batch from what was left in the shed, cutting it thinner than he liked, when he heard Sasha call his name in a voice that wasn't about the vines. Nadia was sitting down in the row, not fallen, just sitting, her face gone the color of old paper, sweat that had stopped coming even though the heat hadn't let up. He was on his knees in front of her before he'd finished crossing the row. He pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist, checked her eyes, felt for the dampness that should have been on her skin, and wasn't.
"Nadia, look at me." Her eyes found his, slow. "Good, stay right there." "Is she?" Sasha started. "Heat exhaustion, not stroke yet, but she stopped sweating, so we don't have long before it tips." He was already moving, voice flat and fast. "Get the cooler from the truck, the wet towels on top, and the water, not the warm jug, the one in the cab. Go." Sasha ran.
He got Nadia into the shade of the equipment shed, elevated her feet on a stacked pallet, wet a bandana from his own water bottle, and laid it against the back of her neck. When Sasha came back with the cooler, he worked fast and sure, wrapping the wet towels at her wrists and throat where the blood ran close to the skin, giving her small sips of water instead of letting her gulp it, watching her pulse under his fingers the whole time like he was reading something off a screen only he could see. "You're doing good," he told her, low, steady. "Just breathe with me." It took 11 minutes by the shed clock before her color came back and her eyes tracked normal, and she asked, in a small, annoyed voice, why everyone was staring at her. Sasha let a breath out she'd apparently been holding the whole time. "You knew exactly what to do."
"Any parent would," Desmond said, not looking up from checking Nadia's pulse one more time.
"That wasn't any parent. That was—" She stopped herself, glancing at Nadia, and didn't finish it there. He got Nadia settled with water and shade and Sasha to watch her, then went back out to the Petit Verdot rows because the second problem hadn't gone anywhere. 3 vines near the end of row 11, thin bark, full sun, no coverage, had gone from green to a scorched, blistered brown in under an hour, cell tissue collapsing under direct light the way he'd read about and never quite believed would happen this fast. He worked down the row with the stretched batch, covering what he could, doing the math in his head on how many vines he could save before the mix ran out. A truck slowed on the county road above the block. He didn't look up until it stopped. Holt Ferguson sat behind the wheel, window down, not laughing this time. He looked at the 3 scorched vines. He looked at Desmond working fast down the row with a half-empty tank. He looked, for a second longer, toward the equipment shed where Nadia sat in the shade with a wet towel around her neck. Neither of them said anything. Holt's hand came up off the wheel. Not a wave, just a lift, like he meant to say something and thought better of it. And then the truck rolled on, slower than it needed to, until it was gone past the bend. Desmond kept spraying until the tank ran dry, 2 rows short of the end. He stood there a minute in the flattening heat, tank empty, and only then did his hand start to shake. Not while it mattered, only after, when there was nothing left to do but stand in a dead row and feel it. He turned so Nadia wouldn't see it from the shed if she was watching. That evening, the county emergency radio confirmed what the sky already had. Hottest temperatures on record for the region, no relief expected before Thursday, and reports coming in from 3 other vineyards in the valley of significant fruit loss overnight, sunburn and collapse spreading through unprotected blocks faster than anyone had modelled for. Chapter 5, Reveal. The co-op called an emergency quality session 3 days after the heat broke, in the tasting room where Holt had once stood, laughing at a fence line of white vines. This time, nobody was laughing. Folding chairs had been dragged in along the walls, and the long table at the front was covered in yield reports instead of wine glasses. Gary Wexler ran the numbers first. 3 growers in the valley had lost between 30 and 60% of their exposed fruit to sunburn and cell collapse. Bill Tackett's whole east block was gone. Holt's own reserve acreage, uncovered because he'd never needed anything before, had come in scorched on nearly half the vine. Then Gary pulled up Rustling Creek's numbers. 4% lost, concentrated entirely in 3 vines on 1 row that had run out of coverage before the supplier restocked. The room went quiet in a way that had weight to it, not the kind of quiet somebody fills right away. "Explain it," Gary said. And it wasn't an accusation this time, just a request. "Whatever you did, the committee needs to understand it before we write the season off as a loss for half this valley." Desmond stood, carried the field journal to the front, and opened it flat on the table so the rows of numbers faced the room instead of him. "I logged berry surface temperature on every block starting 3 years ago. Same time of day, same instrument. Control rows against treated rows. Kaolin particle film drops surface temperature 8 to 12 degrees, depending on application density. That's the difference between cell tissue that survives a heat spike and tissue that doesn't.
That's not something you figure out from a farming forum, someone near the back said.
Desmond didn't answer that directly. He set his phone on the table, propped against a water pitcher, and dialed. It rang twice before a woman's voice came through, steady and unhurried. "Dr. Whitcomb," Desmond said, "I've got the Nelson County Growers Co-op here. They'd like to understand the protocol." Of course. A pause, papers shifting somewhere on her end. "Desmond ran controlled particle film trials under my supervision at the university before he left the program. What you're looking at is a field continuation of research neither of us ever got to publish. I'll tell you plainly, it's rigorous. I've reviewed his data every season since. If anything, the field conditions have made it more precise than what we had in the trial plots." "Left the program?" Gary repeated slowly. "That's a longer conversation than I have time for right now," Dr. Whitcomb said, not unkindly. "And it isn't really the committee's business why. What's your business is that the method works, and he's the reason any of you have a crop left to sell this year." Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Holt sat near the back with his cap in his hands, turning it slowly, not looking at anyone. Desmond ended the call and closed the journal, one hand resting flat on the cover the way it had rested on Nadia's shoulder the day the heat almost took her. "I didn't bring this here to prove anybody wrong," he said. "I brought it because you asked, and because half the valley is about to have the same problem again next July if nobody changes anything." Bill Tackett, who hadn't laughed that first morning at the fence line, was the first to speak. "What's the application rate for a block our size?"
"Depends on your canopy density and varietal," Desmond said. "I can walk you through it."
Holt stood up like he meant to say something, chair scraping back hard enough that a few heads turned. He held that position a second too long, mouth half open, and then sat back down without a word, his cap still turning over in his hands. Gary cleared his throat into the silence Holt left behind. "Would you be willing to present the protocol to the full co-op membership? Formally, before next season?" Desmond looked around the room, at Bill Tackett waiting on an answer, at the empty chair where Holt's outburst had almost happened, at the yield numbers still glowing on the screen behind Gary's shoulder, and understood that the question underneath the question wasn't really about kaolin clay anymore.
"I can do that," he said.
Chapter 6. Residual Respect. Harvest came in the first week of September, cooler mornings finally back over the ridge, and Desmond spent most of it exactly where he always spent it, bent low over a row, checking sugar levels with a refractometer, while Nadia hauled half-full lugs to the trailer and complained they were heavier than last year. A truck came up the drive around 9. Desmond recognized the engine before he recognized the truck. Holt Ferguson parked well off to the side this time, out of the way of the trailer, and got out holding a spiral notebook that still had the price sticker on the back cover. He stood at the end of the row for a moment before he came any closer, like a man deciding whether he still had the right to walk onto somebody else's land uninvited.
"Desmond," he said the name plain, no joke folded into it. "Got a minute?"
"About done with this row." Desmond didn't stop working. "What do you need?" Holt turned the notebook over once in his hands. "Application rate for the reserve block. I want to do it right this time, not just throw clay at it and hope." He hesitated. Figured I'd ask the person who actually knows, instead of guessing again. Desmond straightened up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at him a moment before he answered. There was no speech in him for this, nothing that needed saying about the fence line or the county road, or the morning Holt had waved 3 men over to laugh. He just told him the rate, the timing, the mistake most people made, spraying too thin on the west-facing rows. Holt wrote it down carefully in the awkward, careful hand of a man not used to being the one taking notes. "Obliged," he said when he'd finished, and for a second looked like he might say more than that. Didn't, and turned back toward his truck instead. He got 2 steps before he stopped and looked back at Nadia, who was watching him with open curiosity from the trailer. "Your dad's the smartest man in this valley, you know that?" Nadia glanced at her father, who kept his face carefully unreadable, and said, "I know," like it wasn't news. Holt almost smiled at that. He climbed into his truck and drove off slower than he needed to, same as the day he'd driven past the scorched row, and lifted one hand instead of a joke. Sasha came down the row a few minutes later with an infrared thermometer of her own, a cheaper model she'd bought with her first paycheck, and handed it to Nadia to try. The girl aimed it at a cluster the way she'd watched her father do it 100 times, called out the number too loud, and grinned when Desmond nodded like she'd gotten it right. Later, when the trailer was loaded and the light had gone long across the rows, Desmond's field journal sat open on the truck's tailgate where he'd left it, its cover soft at the corners, the old envelope still tucked inside the front flap where it had ridden for years. A breeze off the ridge lifted a page and let it fall again, and nobody moved to close it. Somewhere down the drive, Holt's notebook sat on his own dashboard now, one page filled in a stranger's careful hand, the rest of it still blank, waiting on next season to decide what got written there.